Hi, you're watching The Big Picture with me, Ishan Russell. Tonight at The Big Picture, we focus on the National Encryption Policy. What exactly is that policy and why has the government withdrawn it? We'll be talking about that and also the larger message as far as the government's Digital India program goes and what it's been putting out as far as policy go. We'll be talking about it because there has been a slight disconnect in that. Ravi Viswasarya Sharda Prasad, he's an independent telecom consultant. He joins us. Kunal Kapoor joins us, member of the BJP IT cell. Kashish joins us. She's a senior journalist who's covered the internet-related domain for quite some time now. And Pavan Duggal joins us. He's a senior advocate at the Supreme Court and also a cyber law expert. Ravi, I'll start with you. As far as the National Encryption Policy is concerned, first let's understand the need. Why is there a need for such a policy? And then we'll try to understand why is there such a hullabaloo about it.
Okay, well, this policy was required, but not in the way it was drafted. First of all, if you look at issues of national security, where let's say the government needs to snoop on a suspect, it's already covered under Section 69 of the Information Technology Act, which specifies conditions under which the government can intercept, monitor and decrypt communications. Right. And such conditions are the sovereignty and integrity of India, security of the state, friendly relations with foreign countries, to prevent the incitement of any offence, to investigate any offence, or for public order. Now, these are the only conditions under which the government can snoop on an individual's messages. So now, about the need of this encryption policy under Section 84A, it's required for, but the way it was drafted, it is required for, let's say, the way governments should departments should communicate. So what the government should have done, should have said that entities should maintain certain minimum security standards which ensure the privacy and integrity of data, of users' privacy, and to ensure that, let's say, financial transactions are upheld, that they're not broken into, that there's no cracking into bank accounts, that there is no danger to national security, that national secrets are not compromised, that users' privacy is maintained, and that they're not vulnerable to databases being hacked into or blackmail or any of those. So a kind of policy was required, but basically such a policy just needs to say that these are the minimum encryption standards, security standards, which organizations
rather than setting
should
standards, the government, and Kunal, I want to get you in on this because this is a government that came in riding on social media. You are one of the soldiers of social media for the BJP. Now, in terms of how the BJP has been communicating as far as policy matters are concerned, I mean, I outlined the net neutrality controversy, the porn ban controversy. Now, this one, is the government missing a step as far as its vision of Digital India goes, but what it's implementing on the ground?
Not really. I mean, I'll break this issue, your question into two parts. One is the specific issue of this encryption policy. As far as this policy is concerned, this was a draft which was made by a group of experts. Clearly, this was not in sync with the policy of the government. That is precisely the reason the minister in the morning itself made a very categorical clarification on the issue. He has clearly said social media will not be covered in this, messaging services like WhatsApp will not be covered in this, and payment gateways will not be covered in this. Do we need a policy? Yes, we surely do need a policy because we live in a world where cyber crimes today is a reality. Right. Was this the answer? Obviously, it was a draft which was not in sync with the policy of the government. That is precisely the reason the government has clearly said to redraft the policy.
The government's washed its hands off it, but Kashish, the larger question still remains about the mindset of the government as far as control over the internet goes.
You know, Ishan, I just want to respond to what Kunal just said. I think a huge amount of outcry that we're seeing over this policy is also very unanimous in nature. And I think that's what's really interesting, and that's what's caused the government to actually take steps back. Again on net neutrality, again on the porn debate, and again on this particular one as well. Are we looking at a government that's completely out of sync with who's drafting its policy and who's actually announcing it? After all, the DATI, the Department of Electronics and IT and Communication, is part of the Ministry of IT and Communication, which is headed by Ravi Shankar Prasad. How can it be possible that the government has, in fact, not known about these policies that were being drafted without them actually being faced with a situation where they have to
I'll
take
let
those
you
back.
respond, Kunal. I'll let you respond, but I want to get in Pavan Duggal.
Specific issues, which one of them I want to respond.
Yeah, but I want to get in Pavan Duggal because he's somebody who's worked actively with the government in terms of drafting such policies, and not particularly this one. I don't know whether you were involved with this one, Pavan, or whether you were consulted. But as far as the national encryption policy goes, first let's talk about that, your take on that, and also a little bit about the government's attitude and its mindset towards drafting policies that govern the internet.
Well, I think this entire draft policy has brought forward large number of legal and policy concerns. At the very outset, I was not consulted for this policy, so I can't really comment on the process that went for the same. But the fact remains is that this entire policy is a misplaced policy, primarily because it does not even follow the mandate given by the Parliament. Way back in 2008, the Information Technology Amendment Act 2008 was passed by Parliament, and the Parliament actually inserted a new section, being Section 84A. Under Section 84A, the Parliament mandated the central government to basically prescribe the various methods or modes of encryption. But the government or the Parliament categorically said that that's going to be for three purposes. One objective will be to promote the secure use of the electronic medium. Second will be to promote e-commerce. And the third will be for promoting electronic governance. Well, unfortunately, when this new policy comes up, none of these objectives which are given under Section 84A actually find mention in the objectives of the policy. On top of it, we find that there are new objectives put in, and the policy goes on a tangent. And this policy is completely deficient in the sense that it does not even look at the role of intermediaries and service providers.
Right.
If service providers are providing encryption, the primary responsibility for seeing the way the encryption is not misused has to be of the service provider, because they are an intermediary. They get covered under the Information Technology Act 2000.
Right.
But the draft is completely silent. Rather, the draft goes ahead and puts a very onerous responsibility on all users of communication devices, mobiles and computers in India for the purposes of saving, pasting and saving in the text form all the encrypted messages that they send for 90 days.
Right.
Why? Because the law enforcement could ask them, what happens if you don't give them? You could be prosecuted for criminal offenses. That's what has suddenly taken the main shift.
Does that worry you in terms of a larger mindset of the government?
Suddenly you cannot ask the citizens to monitor. Well, there's a bigger issue because clearly this actually is showing that there's somewhere down the line the need for accessing huge volumes of data. But why? The government, if it wants to fight cybercrime, needs to target those people who are suspects and thereafter go ahead and do things. But you cannot put the Indian nation and the entire Indian citizenry to a shadow of potential criminality and tell them that if you don't really save, I'm going to prosecute you. I think that's a wrong approach to get started with. And that's actually hit a raw nerve. But most significantly, I think even otherwise, when you look at the policy is talking of registration. Which age are we living in? Registration for all service providers? I think the policy potentially is expecting that people are dying to get themselves registered. That's no longer the case. The fact is that internet has made geography history, and encryption service providers are no longer interested in getting your registrations done. So one of the bigger problems with the policy will be, how will you actually enforce this policy? More so on foreign service
as far as
providers.
the policy itself
And
is
somewhere down
concerned,
the line,
the government
entire
has withdrawn
activities
it.
are infringing.
But Ishan, it's very worrying to see that the government, in a short span of just this year, has withdrawn three policies.
Pavan, we'll just come back to you.
Well, it's withdrawn three policies. And you were asking that question about what is the perception of the government in terms of social media and the internet and what kind of messages this withdrawal is actually sending out. I feel that a huge amount of people in the country, especially all the urban users and the small town urban users who brought in this government, not just for the Digital India Thrust, but also the fact that the entire government and the entire party gave this huge huge perception that they're very, very good with not just online tools, but the use of social media. And that's one of the biggest reasons, attributes why this government has come to power. To see a government that's completely in sync with using the power of social media, but not understanding the fallouts, is a very, very huge disconnect for the user. And in that sense, all the people, even on social media, who supported this government are coming out and voicing their opinions against the government's policies.
Right.
So there itself is a wake-up call for what kind of perception this government is actually giving out.
And in fact, BJP members too. BJP members too have come.
So if I could respond,
go ahead,
okay.
respond.
Now let me respond. Give me my time. Vanish has talked about the perception of the government. Let me tell you, this government has an excellent perception, and that is precisely the reason on social media every day our trends are still on the top. So as far as that part is concerned,
Actually, the trends today,
let me complete. Let me complete. Give me my time. I give you your time. Respect that. See, as far as this government is concerned, you're talking about digital India. Digital India, don't just restrict digital India to this policy. Secondly, as far as this policy
then what do we restrict it to?
Let me complete. As far as this policy is concerned, if this was the view of the government withdrew it in 24 hours. The previous government did not withdraw it in 6 months.
The bigger worry is
and the point is how many people, the same people sitting in studios
even
today
66A
who are
and
talking
about
about
that was only taken back by the government.
The point is, okay, let's come to section 66A.
See, this is a government which responds to its citizens. That is precisely the reason in 24 hours.
But Kunal, the question is not about responding.
This is a policy. This is not a policy. This is a draft policy.
This conversation is not going anywhere. Ravi, I'll just ask you to intervene over here. In terms of perception, I mean, perception is very difficult to judge. Kunal saying that the government is doing very well in terms of perception, but the kind of controversy that has erupted over such a policy certainly shows a picture that is a little on the other side. But as far as the larger mindset is concerned, I want to explore that because there is a need in terms of security that it's a completely changed scenario. We recently had, if I quote an international example, France passing a legislation that impinged upon the rights of privacy as far as a citizen is concerned online, but that is considered necessary in this day and age. Is that a mindset that the Indian security establishment is also trying to enforce upon the rest of the government?
Oh yes, absolutely. In fact, you've always had this kind of debate between national security, anti-terrorism, and civil liberties and privacy. And that's going on in all countries. In fact, UK and Europe have far more stringent laws than us. Now, if I go back to this policy, looking purely as a technical person, as a person who's worked in encryption for years, a lot of this doesn't make sense at all because the policy lags far behind usage. For instance, on my smartphones, I have a couple of apps which I use for making secure phone calls. Okay, these are secure phone calls which cannot be tapped. Now, I'm already using it. This policy makes that illegal. I have a few apps which I use for sending secure messages, which again cannot be tapped easily in real time. Again, this policy makes that illegal. This policy goes around saying you should use RC4, which has already been proved to be unsafe, which has already been cracked into triple DES, which are symmetric.
All right, but not talking about this policy in particular. I'm talking about the larger mindset because
I think somehow, like the government's intentions are right, but they're not getting the nitty-gritty right.
Also, Ishan, I just want to quickly make a point. I mean, if we're told, let's take the example of digital India, and let's not go into perception, but let's look at the fact that the government is really keen on bringing India online and using the power of the internet today to connect people, to allow them access to things they never had before.
Right.
Perhaps the biggest question and the biggest difference between international countries and our country is that we just don't have a privacy law. At least countries abroad have a privacy law, which means that today as a user, if the government was to snoop or surveil me for reasons which are out of the ambit of the law, I would have at least one place that I can go to which will hold up my rights. Right. But at the moment, there's nothing. So if the government snoops on me...
The draft privacy bill has been hanging fire for years.
For years, absolutely. So if the government wanted to change their perception of how well they understand the space, they would do well to bring up the privacy law and pass it.
Kunal, I'll come to you.
I think the government's political instincts are right, but it's not able to take experts on the board. It's not consulting the proper
I just want to get in Pavan Duggal before I let you respond, Kunal, because you won't respond to even Pavan Pavan Duggal on this one. Pavan, as far as what we've been talking about, the government mindset, the larger idea, the larger policy framing itself, as far as that disconnect is concerned, do you think it's becoming too apparent? And as far as the necessity in a change scenario, in a change communication and security scenario, do you think that this is a subject that will keep coming up, especially given the fact, as Kashish was pointing out, that the right to privacy of an individual is also not established under our law?
I completely agree that there's a huge disconnect. But ultimately, we really have to go to the core of the problem. The core of the problem is concerning cyber security. And that's one area that India is thoroughly unprepared for. As on date, when I talk with you, India does not have any dedicated cyber security legislation. The amendments to the Information Technology Act 2000 and 2008 have been insufficient and do not really serve the specific purpose. And why are we talking about these policies in isolation, in separate segregated silos? The fact is we have to look at that all these aspects are interrelated and interconnected. In fact, I think countries like China are miles ahead from India. Why? Because China 2 months back has come up with a new national law on national security. And the way they've actually gone ahead and defined national security is so wide enough to include all elements of cyber security as an integral component thereof. Russia has taken a different stand.
Right.
1st of September 2015, Russia has implemented a law which mandates you may be a service provider located anywhere in the world, but if you're dealing with the data pertaining to Russians, you will have to get that processed within Russia per se. So I think India is pretty much confused on which direction it wants to take. You cannot deal with independent elements which go and make a part of the overall ecosystem of cybersecurity in independent silos, but they must talk with each other. And we must have a holistic perspective.
Right.
But just before Kunal responds, can I just add to what Pavan is saying? I also just want to say, you know, one of the things that that's come up very recently, and I know there's a report that's actually being worked on, which is going to be presented to the government, is how unsafe all the routers that we use at home are. All the routers we use at home are so very elegantly unsafe that it's actually so easy for any international country to actually just hack into our systems, and that includes the government agencies. And that's the kind of thrust that should be a part of the cybersecurity policy of the government, not come out with something that looks like snooping.
All right, and Kunal, just adding to this, the fact that, I mean, I'll come back to this. During the election campaign, I remember there was an entire conversation about getting data centers, that all internet companies, all major service providers should have their data centers in India. Now, then you had the net neutrality, then you had so on and so forth. In that sense, don't you think that somewhere down the line, I mean, you must be facing it, handling the BJP's own social media, that you must be getting brickbats over there, don't you?
No. See, there are two things. Now, all of them, the three panelists here, they swing from one side to the another. One is the national security. They get in China, who they think is far, and there they forget the privacy law. Let me complete. On the China thing, they forget the privacy law. On the India thing, they forget the national security. So when you talk about, he just mentioned, Pavan Duggal, China, they're way ahead of us. What about the privacy laws? She was just mentioning about privacy laws. Yeah. What about China's privacy laws?
It doesn't matter what China. We want to know what the Indian government is doing.
Chinese model. This country cannot follow a Chinese model or a French model.
Where is the Indian
model? Is very clear. There has to be a fine balance.
But there has to be being maintained, given the fact that every major policy decision that has come out in the IT sector.
What has Ravi Shankar Prasad said today? He said, do we need a policy? We definitely need a policy. Will the policy cover social media? Will the policy cover messenger services? No, it won't. So the policy is very clear. That is the larger people
what
will
Pavan
not
Duggal was also pointing out. Pavan, correct me if I'm wrong. What Pavan Duggal was also pointing out, that it can't be viewed in isolation. You can't view it as this policy will only cover.
So when you're saying China is ahead of us and you're not taking care of the privacy laws, then you're not looking at isolation.
See, I'm not talking about China. I'm only talking about the
But he did talk about China, and he said China is way ahead of us.
That's okay.
So was he not talking in isolation?
I'm talking about from the Indian perspective.
In certain areas. First is for the defense forces, the armed forces.
We'll come to you, Pavan.
Intelligence agencies. You need encryption policies for intelligence agencies, defense forces. You need policies for the government sector. And what was very clearly specified in Section 84A, which is for e-governance and e-commerce. Okay, the mandate of Section 84A of the Information Technology Act was for essentially for encryption for e-governance services, that what the government is rendering to the common citizen.
Right.
Okay, but you don't need security policies to govern ISPs and others in banks. They can very well take care of themselves. You basically need to say certain standards that they have to just keep these certain minimum security standards in place, which can be done by a set of rules from time to time, which the government can notify. You don't need a policy for that. It can be done under rules and notifications.
All right, Pavan Duggal, respond. You wanted to come in.
Can I just supplement to what Ravi is saying? When I've actually given the example of China, I've just given the example to say, look, the countries are miles ahead. The way they are defining national security is so broad enough to include all components of cyber security. And whereas we are in India, we are not even talking about the complete ecosystem of cyber security. We are only talking of one small component, which is of encryption. And now you make a mockery of this entire encryption process by telling that, okay, all kinds of social media sites and social media applications are outside the ambit and are exempt. Mind you, all mobile applications are still not exempt. So clearly, there's a disconnect in the thought process. And why do we look at it in very small, specific buckets? Ultimately, the totality of the picture has to be seen. Are we not aware of the fact that Indian networks are being constantly attacked and hacked by state and non-state actors? In a scenario like this, what is the rationale of this policy telling the government agencies that you also secure all your encrypted messages, save them in the text form on governmental networks, which are being hacked on a daily basis? And mind you, this entire retention process has been prescribed without even prescribing the minimum standards or reasonable security practices and procedures that a user needs to have. And finally, why are we forgetting the intermediaries? At the end of the day, it is their job to go ahead and collate all the logs and this respective electronic documentation. Why should the responsibility be put on stuff? So the idea of putting in China was not to say that India goes the China way. The idea is, like as Gandhiji said, let's get the winds from all directions coming to my home by opening all my windows. And I think we cannot be looking into a well by saying, look, we are India, we only want to deal with encryption, and we are not bothered on what's happening across the world. So far more holistic and a comprehensive approach is required to this entire process.
All right, Kashish, very quickly.
I just really quickly wanted to say, I know you were talking about surveillance and Sir over there was talking about freedom and privacy. You know, I just got a couple of figures from a Pew Research, which says that 52% of Americans believe it's acceptable to monitor communication by leaders. And in India, only 37% Indians think it's acceptable to monitor communication by leaders, and this is just by leaders. So you're looking already at numbers which give you a sense of what is our perception towards being surveilled, towards being snooped, towards invasion of our privacy. And, you know, I think numbers already show that most Indians will be up against, in arms, against privacy, against snooping, against surveillance. And, you know, we've looked at the Snowden controversy earlier. And if you bring that back to India, this is essentially what it's looking like, that the government essentially is coming out looking like they're being perceived as somebody who wants to snoop on every single citizen.
All right, Kunal, I'll
as
give
far
you
as
the
that
final
part
word.
is concerned, I completely agree with her. And I think even 37% is a very high percentage. India is a vibrant democracy. This is a party which has fought against snooping and surveillance all throughout the history of this party.
Right.
So as far as we are concerned, we are very clear. We do not endorse surveillance and snooping in a blanket way. We don't.
All right, if you
You might run into trouble with that recent Gujarat controversy, but I'm not going to bring that up, right?
I mean, irrespective, we'll divert. We'll divert. So the final word,
You
Kunal.
did it for 12 years still.
It doesn't matter what anybody did in the past
I
or
wasn't
is
part
doing
of any
now. What I'm
Congress
worried about is as far as what the government is doing. And that we need to figure out, and that the BJP perhaps needs to define its own stand, that as far as these important policy matters go, that where is the larger policy? We're talking about Digital India, which is a great branding exercise, but in terms of the policy behind it, in terms of actual implementation, I mean, there hasn't been that much that has happened. And as you, as somebody who has used the internet greatly to benefit the BJP, don't you agree so?
No, but as I said, we've just launched this program 6 months back. This is a government which is a 15-month-old government. And this government, within 15 months, have shown a clear direction. We want Skill India, we want Digital India, we want Swachh Bharat. All the major issues are being put on the table. Now, within 15 months, you want us to do things which the previous governments couldn't do for 60 years. For 60 years, people couldn't do things, and now in 15 months, you want us to do everything. Now it doesn't work that way, my friend. We are forming the policy. If the policy of the government was to snoop, we would have not withdrawn. We would have not withdrawn if the policy of the government was to...
But, I mean, the,
The
UPA,
fact that the government-
UPA made their own mistakes during that time. We all remember the BlackBerry controversy
Right.
and, of course, the recent one.
But I don't remember the time when, before a policy was announced or implemented, somebody made a controversy or withdrew it. We withdrew it at the time of drafting of the policy.
Right, so...
All right, but that doesn't deny the perception that
There is a huge difference between UPA and NDA.
That is the difference that people had voted for, and
I'm sure they'll vote
whether
again
that's
for
coming
that
through or not.
difference.
I mean, you handle the social media for the BJP, so I'm sure you get to know it firsthand. But we'll have to wrap this discussion up at this juncture only. Of course, we'll revisit this topic because as far as this policy is concerned, well, it's a constantly evolving one. Pavan Duggal, thank you very much for coming in on this and sitting in on this. Kashish, thank you very much. Ravi and Kunal, it was a pleasure to have all of you on this show. Well, that's a wrap on the big picture for today. What do you think about it? Do let us know. On that note, we'll be back tomorrow again with another edition. Thanks so much for watching.